March 7, 1945, at 3:50 in the afternoon, American reconnaissance units approaching the town of Remagen reported something that made little sense. One of the last major bridges across the Rhine rigged for demolition and guarded by German forces was still standing. For months, Allied planners had assumed every crossing would be destroyed long before they arrived. Now a steel roadway into the heart of Germany remained intact, and no one on either side was fully prepared for what that meant. Within minutes, the situation began to shift. U.S. infantry from the 9th Armored Division moved toward the Ludendorff Bridge under sporadic artillery and machine gun fire. German engineers attempted a final demolition, but the charges failed to bring the structure down. The explosion damaged the bridge yet left it passable. By late afternoon, American soldiers were already running across it, establishing a foothold on the eastern bank. A defensive line that German planners had spent years preparing was being breached in real time. For decades, the Rhine had been viewed as Germany's ultimate shield. Stretching from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, the river guarded the industrial Ruhr and the central transport networks that sustained the German war effort. In military theory, any attacking force would be forced to halt at its western bank, reorganize, and attempt a costly river assault under fire. That delay was expected to buy Germany precious time, but by early 1945, time had become a luxury the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. Units assigned to defend the river were exhausted from months of retreat across France and Belgium. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Communications between commands were increasingly unreliable. The Rhine still existed as a formidable geographic barrier, but the military system tasked with defending it had been worn down by years of continuous war. As the first American bridgehead expanded east of Remagen, a harsh reality began to settle in. Germany's last great defensive line was being tested not at its strongest point, but at its weakest moment, and the outcome would determine how quickly the war in the West would end. For much of the war, German strategic planning treated the Rhine as more than a river. It was a defensive anchor designed to shield the industrial core of the Reich and stabilize the Western Front in the event of invasion. During World War I, enemy forces had never managed to cross it in strength. That historical memory shaped expectations in 1944 and 1945, when German commanders again looked to the river as the final barrier capable of halting an advance from the west. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, German forces conducted a prolonged fighting withdrawal across France and the Low Countries. By autumn, the front had shifted toward Germany's borders. Defensive preparations intensified. Bridges were wired with explosives. Artillery positions were established along likely crossing points, and remaining armored formations were assigned to sectors where a major assault was expected. On operational maps, the Rhine appeared as a natural fortress that could compensate for Germany's shrinking manpower and resources. Yet the strategic situation deteriorated faster than defensive plans could be implemented. The failure of the Ardennes offensive in January 1945 consumed Germany's last substantial reserves of fuel and armor. Divisions sent to reinforce the western defenses arrived depleted. Many formations listed on paper as fall divisions could muster only a few thousand combat-effective troops. Equipment shortages were severe. Some units defending key sectors of the river possessed little heavy artillery and only limited transport. Logistical strain compounded the problem. Allied bombing campaigns had systematically targeted railways and supply depots throughout western Germany. Moving reinforcements to the Rhine became increasingly difficult. Units often arrived without sufficient ammunition or fuel to sustain prolonged operations. Commanders were instructed to hold the line at all costs, but the means to do so were steadily disappearing. While German planners spoke of a fortress along the Rhine, the reality was a thin and fragile defensive network stretched across hundreds of miles. And across the river, Allied armies were not preparing for a prolonged stalemate. They were assembling the resources needed to cross quickly and decisively before Germany could rebuild any semblance of strength. By February 1945, German High Command reports still described the Rhine as a defensible line. Reinforcements were being assembled. Volkssturm battalions, teenagers, factory workers, and elderly veterans were rushed toward the Western Front. Armored units withdrawn from shattered formations were reorganized into ad hoc battle groups. On paper, it appeared that Germany was concentrating its remaining strength for one final defensive stand, but these reports masked a growing gap between planning and reality. The failed Ardennes offensive had consumed far more than tanks and fuel. It had drained Germany of experienced crews, trained officers, and logistical reserves that could not be replaced. When surviving units retreated back toward Germany's borders in January 1945, many arrived with only a fraction of their original strength. Panzer divisions that once fielded hundreds of armored vehicles sometimes reported fewer than 30 operational tanks. Infantry divisions were reduced to improvised battalions held together by exhausted veterans and poorly trained replacements. The logistical network supporting them was collapsing. Allied bombing had crippled rail junctions across the Rhineland and the Ruhr. Fuel shipments were irregular and often intercepted. Ammunition production struggled to keep pace with demand. Units ordered to defend key crossing points frequently received only limited supplies, forcing commanders to ration artillery fire and restrict vehicle movement. Some formations positioned along the river lacked even the transport necessary to redeploy if breakthroughs occurred. Communication failures worsened the situation. Telephone lines were repeatedly cut by bombing raids. Radio equipment was scarce and unreliable. Orders from high headquarters often arrived late or conflicted with local conditions. Coordination between neighboring units became increasingly difficult as the front fragmented into isolated sectors. Despite official assurances, the Rhine Line was not being defended by a cohesive, well-equipped force. It was held by a patchwork of depleted formations struggling to maintain the appearance of strength. And as Allied reconnaissance intensified along the western bank, it became clear that appearances would not be enough to hold the line once the crossings began. By early 1945, the most decisive factor shaping the defense of the Rhine was not terrain or fortifications but control of the air. Allied air forces operated over western Germany with near total freedom. American and British aircraft conducted continuous reconnaissance and bombing missions targeting railways, bridges, supply depots, and troop movements. Any German unit attempting to reposition during daylight risked immediate detection and attack. Fighter bombers patrolled major roads and rail lines leading toward the river. Convoys carrying reinforcements or fuel were frequently dispersed before reaching their destinations. Transport columns moved primarily at night, slowing the already strained flow of supplies. Even then, shortages persisted. Fuel production inside Germany had been severely reduced by sustained bombing of synthetic refineries. Armored units assigned to defend the Rhine often lacked the fuel needed for large-scale maneuver or counterattack. The Luftwaffe, once capable of contesting Allied air superiority, had been reduced to limited and sporadic operations. Aircraft losses, pilot shortages, and chronic fuel scarcity prevented sustained resistance. Anti-aircraft defenses remained formidable around major cities, but coverage along the vast length of the Rhine was uneven. Many defensive sectors relied on only a handful of guns with restricted ammunition supplies. This imbalance allowed Allied reconnaissance aircraft to observe German positions with increasing accuracy. Artillery sites, bridge demolitions, and defensive concentrations were photographed and mapped. Information flowed rapidly to Allied headquarters, enabling precise targeting of critical infrastructure and troop movements. German commanders attempting to reinforce threatened sectors often found their efforts disrupted before they could take effect. As bombing intensified in February and March, key bridges and transport hubs behind the Rhine were repeatedly struck. The defenders of the river faced a growing realization. Even before Allied troops attempted major crossings, the logistical and operational foundations of their defense were being systematically dismantled from the air. It was one of the most critical demolition targets in western Germany. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had been wired with explosives and assigned a dedicated demolition team months before Allied forces reached the Rhine. Orders were explicit. If enemy troops approached within artillery range, the bridge was to be destroyed immediately. German command considered its survival unacceptable under any circumstances. Yet on March 7, 1945, a sequence of delays, miscommunications, and technical failures allowed the structure to remain standing long enough to change the course of the campaign. As elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division advanced toward Remagen, German defenders prepared to execute the demolition plan. Engineers attempted to detonate charges as American troops entered the outskirts of the town. The explosion damaged sections of the bridge and tore craters into the roadway, but the main structure held. Faulty wiring, insufficient explosives, and previous Allied bombing had weakened the demolition setup. The bridge was still usable. American commanders reacted with urgency. Infantry units rushed forward under machine gun and artillery fire, crossing the damaged span while engineers worked to neutralize remaining charges. Tanks and armored vehicles followed cautiously. Within hours, a bridgehead had been established on the eastern bank. Reinforcements began to pour across, expanding the foothold before German forces could organize an effective counterattack. The psychological impact was immediate. German leadership had relied on the Rhine as a defensive buffer that could delay the Allied advance for weeks. Instead, a major crossing had been seized intact. Hitler responded with fury, ordering courts-martial for officers involved in the failed demolition. Several were executed. But retribution could not repair the breach. American engineers quickly constructed additional pontoon bridges nearby, ensuring a steady flow of troops and supplies. Despite repeated German air and artillery strikes, the crossing remained operational. What had been intended as a final barrier became a gateway, and once Allied forces established themselves east of the river at Remagen, the entire defensive logic of the Rhine began to unravel. While the unexpected crossing at Remagen shocked German command, a far larger assault was already in preparation farther north. Allied planners had spent weeks assembling the resources required for a deliberate, large-scale crossing of the Rhine. The operation, codenamed Plunder, would be launched near the town of Wesel and supported by one of the most extensive concentrations of artillery and engineering equipment assembled during the war. On March 23, 1945, the offensive began with a massive bombardment. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire along the eastern bank, targeting known and suspected German defensive positions. Heavy bombers followed, striking transport hubs and strong points behind the front. Under cover of darkness, assault troops from British, Canadian, and American formations began crossing the river in landing craft and amphibious vehicles. Engineers worked continuously to construct pontoon bridges capable of supporting tanks and supply convoys. German defenders attempted to resist, but faced overwhelming pressure. Many units assigned to the sector were understrength and poorly supplied. Air attacks disrupted attempts to move reinforcements forward. Artillery fire severed communications between command posts and frontline positions. Without sufficient fuel or armored reserves, coordinated counterattacks proved difficult to organize. In several sectors, defensive lines collapsed within hours of the initial crossings. By the morning of March 24th, Allied forces had secured multiple bridgeheads east of the Rhine. Airborne units dropped behind German lines to disrupt movement and secure key routes. Within days, heavy armor and mechanized infantry were advancing toward the Ruhr, Germany's primary industrial region. The scale and coordination of the operation demonstrated a level of logistical capacity the German military could no longer match. Operation Plunder confirmed what Remagen had already suggested. The Rhine was no longer a defensive shield capable of halting the Allied advance. With major crossings established along multiple sectors, the final natural barrier protecting Western Germany had effectively been overcome. As Allied armies expanded their bridgeheads east of the Rhine, the German command structure began to fracture under the weight of simultaneous crises. Orders from Berlin remained uncompromising. Every position was to be held. Every crossing was to be contested. Retreat without authorization was considered a punishable offense. But the reality on the ground made such directives increasingly impossible to follow. Communication networks had been severely damaged by months of bombing. Telephone lines linking headquarters to frontline units were frequently severed. Radio equipment was limited and often unreliable. In many sectors, divisional and corps commanders operated with only partial knowledge of neighboring units. Some formations fought in isolation, unaware that adjacent defenses had already collapsed or withdrawn. Others received conflicting instructions from different levels of command, creating confusion at critical moments. Logistical shortages further weakened coordination. Fuel reserves were insufficient to support large-scale maneuver or counterattack. Ammunition stocks were inconsistent and often depleted after brief engagements. Armored units assigned to respond to Allied crossings sometimes lacked the fuel needed to reach threatened sectors. Attempts to assemble coherent defensive lines east of the river were repeatedly disrupted by airstrikes and artillery bombardment. Morale among German troops varied widely. Veteran units that had fought on multiple fronts attempted to maintain discipline, but many formations consisted of hastily assembled replacements with limited training. Some resisted stubbornly in towns and defensive positions. Others surrendered in growing numbers as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany. Civilian refugees crowded roads and rail lines, complicating military movement and adding to the sense of disintegration. By late March 1945, the Rhine no longer functioned as a unified defensive front. Instead, it marked the beginning of a broader collapse in coordination and control. German forces east of the river were increasingly unable to operate as a coherent army, setting the stage for the rapid Allied advance that would follow. Within weeks of the initial crossings, the strategic consequences of the Rhine's failure became unmistakable. Allied forces advanced rapidly into western Germany, converging on the Ruhr industrial region. This area, long considered the economic heart of the German war effort, contained critical factories, rail hubs, and supply networks. Once encircled by American and British armies in April 1945, the Ruhr pocket trapped hundreds of thousands of German troops with limited supplies and no viable escape route. The loss of this region marked a decisive turning point. German units isolated within the pocket were gradually forced to surrender. Elsewhere, Allied armored formations pushed eastward toward the Elbe River, encountering increasingly fragmented resistance. Attempts by German commanders to establish new defensive lines proved short-lived. Fuel shortages, equipment losses, and the absence of effective air support made sustained resistance difficult to maintain. Cities along the Rhine that had prepared for prolonged defense found themselves bypassed or occupied with limited fighting. Infrastructure was heavily damaged, and civilian populations faced the immediate realities of occupation and displacement. For many German soldiers and civilians, the rapid Allied advance underscored how quickly the strategic situation had deteriorated once the river barrier was breached. By the end of April 1945, organized German resistance in the west had largely collapsed. The Rhine, once regarded as an impregnable defensive boundary, had failed to delay the Allied advance for more than a few weeks. Geography alone had not been enough to compensate for depleted manpower, disrupted logistics, and fractured command. Along the riverbanks, damaged bridges and abandoned fortifications remained as evidence of a final defensive plan that had depended on time and resources Germany no longer possessed. The fall of the Rhine did not end the war by itself, but it removed the last major obstacle between the Allied armies and the heart of a collapsing regime.